Good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to do a presentation at the very first session of this extraordinary meeting. I'm going to, my paper is going to shed some light on a dimension of cross-strait relation which I believe has been so far underreported, underappreciated, and underrated in a significant way. And I have a living proof to back up that statement. In the presentation that you'll hear from immediately after mine, that would be Yu-San Wu's presentation. He reviewed 7 major theoretical approaches to cross-relation. But his list doesn't include my topic, Taiwan soft power. So I believe this is something worth investigating. And my presentation probably will give you a very different picture, at least very different from this one. Okay, Bruce Gillig, just a couple of weeks ago, published his new article in Foreign Affairs, which generated a lot of discussion, or even you might say controversy, here and in the United States. The title of his Foreign Affairs article is Finlandization of Taiwan, okay, a very provocative one. And I think his view is not, I would say, unusual. Actually, I met with a lot of people, within the Beltway, and they oftentimes express their worry about cross-relation. The trend, the current trend, and the future destiny of Taiwan. And they worry that Taipei probably is drifting into Beijing's sphere of influence. And I think Bruce Gillig, tried to extend that kind of reasoning, to its logical extreme. He emphasized that, the strengthening of relationship, okay, and which has been accelerated in terms of closer economic and political embrace of each other, will lead to a Finlandization of Taiwan. And that is to say that Taiwan will accommodate China's vital interests in much the same way Finland had succumbed to Soviet Union's grand strategy during the Cold War. Well, I will argue that this characterization offers you a very partial picture of the ongoing trend in cross-strait interaction, even a misleading one. I think the same side, the other side of the same coin, however, show another important feature of the current cross-relation. I would say that you can pick a lot of evidence that Beijing's policy toward Taiwan has become more accommodative in the recent past, not just over the last 2 years, but actually over the last decade. At least now I can argue that over time, Beijing has learned to live with Taiwan's democracy. Beijing leaders have found out that if Beijing expects Taipei to adopt more conciliatory policy toward mainland China and backpedal Taiwan independence agenda, it had to win over the heart of Taiwan's people. And also, increasingly, Beijing has handed out carrot and hidden its stick. And I would also argue that a very important shift taking place about 2 years ago when Hu Jintao offered his 6-point announcement. He ostensibly used the peace and development to replace peaceful unification as a guiding principle for conducting cross-relation. And that was widely read as a watershed event in the evolution of Beijing's approach to cross-strait. So how are we going to make sense of this adjustment? I think this adjustment is a mutual adjustment, mutual accommodation. Obviously, this shift in policy, Beijing policy toward Taiwan, is inexplicable within the framework of the mainstream realist paradigm. Under this framework, a smaller player can best ward off the threat of a stronger rival with the right mixture of the balanced power and limited military deterrence, but has no way to move the other side to its favored position. And if you look at, the distribution of power or the hard power, in terms of coercive power and economic strength, Taiwan has suffered from an increasingly unfavorable asymmetrical relationship with mainland China, with the latter enjoying an overwhelming advantage, and that is only growing stronger with each passing day. And I would argue that, to really have a full understanding of this mutual adjustment accommodation that had been identified earlier, it's only possible, if you take into account Taiwan's exercise soft power over mainland China. As a matter of fact, I argue that Taiwan possesses enormous potential in steering the future course of cross-relation, despite of the growing asymmetry in the distribution of hard power. And Taiwan's engagement with mainland China has been also conducive, I would argue that, to enriching the latter's understanding, appreciation of the aspiration and concern of people in Taiwan. Not only that, I think Taiwan's private actors have served the role of change agent by facilitating China's political liberalization, especially through the transmission and dissemination of information, idea, and practical knowledge. By so doing, I will even argue that this island is equally able to shape mainland China's political future. I don't have to really, talk too much about the concept of soft power. I think it's well known, it's especially with the pioneering work by Joseph Nye. But I think, two quotes from his one widely cited book is, I think, still quite useful here. Joe reminds us that soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. It arises from the attractiveness of country cultural, political ideal, and policy. If I would add, I would say, it's also through not just attraction, but oftentimes persuasion, okay? And so he also reminds us that seduction is always more effective than coercion, and many values like democracy, human rights, and individual opportunity are deeply seductive. Okay. Obviously, I think his best case of reference is the United States itself, okay, and maybe many other Western power that tend to possess those important elements. So we don't know exactly, whether his idea can be fully applicable to a case like Taiwan. Especially, we ask the question whether soft power can exist in the absence of hard power. But many of the cases that Joe have analyzed involve either great power, which use soft power to complement its hard power, or at least major player in the international arena. But more recently, I think some scholars try to extend his central theory and try to apply the concept to smaller player, player like New Zealand or Norway, Sweden. And they focus on the concept of public diplomacy. Basically, they show that progressive small power can enhance their respect, credibility, and persuasive power in the national public forum, especially in the eye of foreign public, through economic, technical aid, cultural education exchange, liberal trade and immigration regime, public information service, public relation campaign, second-track activity, engagement, and collaboration with national and international NGO. Well, having said that, I would also remind you that those interesting material again may not be fully applicable in the case to cross-strait situation, but when Taiwan, engaged mainland China, I think most of the cultural, education, and social contact are conducted through the private actor, the NGO, without central coordination of the state. And you might even argue that for many years, with many man-made obstacles and barriers imposed by authority on both sides, and equally, from Taiwan under President Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian. They actually suppress the potential of Taiwan's, exercising soft power over mainland China, and might even dampen the private initiative that might have been taken by the NGO. But nevertheless, I would still argue that the literature on soft power still offer quite a few useful insights. While we have to take into account the uniqueness of cross relations. Well, these are, I think, some of the more relevant points that we might learn from the literature on soft power. Number one, soft power depends more on hard power upon the existence of willing interpreter and receiver. And also, as I mentioned, that soft power is not limited to public diplomacy. And you might even argue that in a democracy like Taiwan, given the long-running division over national identity, it would be very difficult for the government to control or centrally coordinate soft power. And private actors acting spontaneously, in this case, are oftentimes more influential and effective than governing agency. And besides, the two sides, don't officially recognize each other. Neither side, have set up official representative office or any kind of entity, serving that function on the soil of the other side. So only the private sector and NGO, they have, the room for maneuver and to become a very effective player. Another, I think, relevant point from the literature is that culture is a powerful and inexhaustible source of soft power. I think this is true everywhere, but more so in the case of Taiwan. And also, we should look at, the importance of personal contact, because this is a very important channel for exercising soft power. And the last point I want to mention here, that the effect of soft power takes time. You have to be patient, and oftentimes it's very difficult to quantify, the exact effect, with this kind of private sector NGO engagement. But I would argue that over time, on a cumulative basis, it will have, a lot of influence over the shape of cross relations. Now, let me try to offer you the following evidence. Number one, it's not difficult to identify who are these willing interpreter and receiver from Taiwan and mainland China. We have many, professionalization, NGO, religious group, media star, pop, cultural star, who have a great number of followers, viewer, even fan in mainland China. And nowadays, you can even expect that there will be even more of them, when after Taiwan opens the door for mainland Chinese tourists. Last year, we received more than 600,000 mainland tourists, and this year, I bet the number can easily exceed 1 million. And one of the reasons why I think Taiwan, have the potential is that the Taiwan's democratic experiment has been widely watched and extensively talked about in mainland China. I think for ordinary citizens in mainland China and also CCP elite alike, okay? Taiwan democratic experience constitutes a crucial social experiment, but it is the first and only democracy ever installed and practiced in a culturally Chinese society. And also, I think Taiwan's unique mode of democratic transition illustrated a viable exit strategy for a hegemonic party to engineer a peaceful and gradual transition from one-party authoritarianism on the basis of its successful record of economic modernization. So in this sense, I think Taiwan can serve as the Chinese model of social political pluralism, featuring free mass media, autonomous civil organization, open political conversation, and unconstrained individual freedom. And also, I think Taiwan has served as important sources of aspiration for engineering the party state to meet the challenge of rapid socio-economic transformation. Taiwan offers many, many practical know-how about the nuts and bolts of how to develop a modern law-bound state embedded in an open market economy. I think this would be a prerequisite for China to become a constitutional democratic system. Well, I think Taiwan's strength in soft power is not because it's politically democratic, socially pluralistic, but I also think that it's also characterized by its Chineseness. In Taiwan, when mainland Chinese visitors come over, they immediately recognize the affinity between the two societies, and especially with the permeation of the Chineseness in the society in terms of preserving and practicing Chinese culture, social custom, ethnic, dietary habit, concepts like feng shui, Chinese traditional medicine, and value in their daily life. So in this case, I think the element of modernity and element of cultural heritage has been blended into one, which is alive, vibrant, and keep evolving all the time. And so the major actor in this regard are the island's, academia, writer, media star, intellectual, or popular culture, religious group, NGO, and they are numerous. And I also have documented that their strong presence in mainland China, which is not confined to coastal area. Actually, has been spread out throughout China. Nowadays, especially, you can have the satellite signal, which allow a lot of Taiwan TV program to be beamed down to urban residents, and also you have the internet. And the religious group from Taiwan has been very, very active in help China to revive those indigenous religious practice. The textbook by Taiwanese law professor are very important intellectual source as Beijing modernized civic and criminal code. I can give you just one example. Professor Wang Zejian, his textbook has been widely adopted in all the top-notch law schools in mainland China today. Who are these, the change of agent? I don't have time to go through those slides, but I can just give you some, anecdotal evidence. The TV program, weekly program hosted by C.C. Chen is extensively watched. And through those, the program, they have better understanding of Taiwan's internal policy, but also Taiwan's perspective toward a lot of issues. Even the trial of Chen Shui-bian has been fully, extensively covered by, for example, Caijing, the most influential weekly magazine in mainland China. And, and this is WEN-HSIN, who set up a very important experiment site for training the kids from the village, how to narrow the digital divide in Gansu province. You have the new lowland project in Xinjiang, and you have the YU-SHAN Foundation, which is a joint venture between the Taiwan-based entrepreneur and mainland Chinese entrepreneur and from Hong Kong. And the current president of the YU-SHAN is Han Jiahuan. He's a tycoon of the food industry from Taiwan. And not to mention people like Deng Kunyan, who's really vital to the renovation of Suzhou River warehouse area and turn that into a Soho-like, enclave for artists and cultural activities. And this is Mr. Shi Liren. He is advisor to Beijing's new project in developing an international art village in the northern suburban of Beijing. And this gentleman listened to his presentation about his vision about this village, art village, is Liu Qi, the party secretary of Beijing city. And then, and here comes Li Zuyuan, a very, very influential architect who have created at least two landmarks in mainland China today. One is this golden Wensu Buddha statue on top of the Emei mountain, the Golden Peak. And then this Pangu Daguan is one of the most visible skyscraper and also also, I think, a landmark building right next to the Summer Olympics facility, including the bird nest. And SZONYI has established itself extensively in mainland China and operating in mainland China for more than 20 years, okay? And also, I think the Buddhist organization has been very instrumental in setting up this very important forum, this World Buddhist Forum, which signal the adjustment in Beijing policy toward indigenous religion. Okay, this is a signal that they are now willing to give more space and autonomy to traditional religions such as Buddhism. Some important leader from Taiwan, like Xing Fa-Si, has been very instrumental behind the curtain to make this possible. And the last World Buddhist Forum was held concurrently in Wuxi and Taipei, with charter flight carrying the delegation, 7 of them, all the way from Wuxi to Taipei. And not to mention Madu, the belief, which has been very popular along the coastal part of China. And most of the renovation of Madu Temple along the coast, initially, with a lot of important support and help from Taiwan. And Hantang Yuef would be another good example that this is the first assembly from Taiwan that tried to recreate the traditional Han and Tang Dynasty music chamber orchestra, and it's the first group ever invited, okay, to perform inside Forbidden City since 1949. And just give you one example that a tycoon like Yin and Yang, okay, not only he tried to build up an empire of retailing business, like Walmart in China, but also he donated a huge amount of money to create the Guanghua Mandarin School at Beida, and more recently Guanghua Falu Law School at Zhejiang Daxue. And with that, you also came with very intensive exchange program between the Taiwan law scholar, management science scholar, and to go there to educate the future entrepreneur and attorney in mainland China. And this is just some data I can come up with, okay, I will wrap up momentarily, that the impact, okay, on the cumulative basis. Although this survey is not very up to date, it was taken in 2006, okay? Not the best time to measure Taiwan's public image among the mainland Chinese urban residents, because that was under the height of the cross-strait political tension, okay? But the view of Taiwan, the general impression, is slightly better in the United States and far better than in Japan. As this chart can show, the respondents are from two different cities, one from Xiamen, the one closer to Taiwan, and Chengdu, the one which is most far away, okay? And when we ask them to evaluate, on scale, 10-point scale about how democratic the political system in Taiwan and in the United States today as compared to China before reform and China today, and you can see that they can readily recognize that the United States is a significantly far more democratic than China today, and Taiwan is also, more democratic, although occupying kind of a medium point between the United States and China today. So basically, I would argue that over time, I think it becomes increasingly less convincing and legitimate for Beijing to pursue coercive strategy toward Taiwan if the public in mainland China develop a very positive image, are more perceptive to Taiwan's concern and aspiration. I think this, from my point of view, would be the most effective strategy for Taiwan to shape the future cross-relation. And I would argue that it's the soft power of Taiwan is perhaps the only strategy available to the island for protecting its long-term interests and for making Taiwan a significant and responsible constructive player in East Asia and the world state at large. Without it, Taiwan will become increasingly irrelevant and marginalized. Thank you for your attention. And for tolerating me, exceeding my time limit. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chu. Our last presenter, certainly not our least, is our host, Professor YU-SHAN, who is the founding director of the Institute of Political Science at the Academia Sinica. He received his BA from National Taiwan University, his MA from National Zhengzhi Daxue, and his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, where he received the American Political Science Award for Best Dissertation on Public Policy. He's written many books and articles, focusing mostly on the transition from socialism, one of the major sorts of events that's happened since World War II, of course, including comparative economic transformations, mainland China, Hungary, the Soviet Union, and Taiwan, a revision of his dissertation. Communist World in Flux, a comparison of 4 communist regimes in 1995. Away from Socialism, the economic transformation of mainland China, the Soviet Union, and Poland in 1996. Balancing and bandwagoning cross-straits relations, revisited in 1997. Russia's transition, 1992 to 1999, a political economic analysis in 2000. And he's edited and compiled and written many articles and other very important and interesting works. YU-SHAN, as you're well aware, was named after the highest mountain in Taiwan. And while we can't do anything about our names, I think that his parents would be proud to know that he has achieved the highest rank of intellectual achievement and that he has established the leading political science institute here in Taiwan. I give you YU-SHAN.
Thank you, Laura, very much for your kind words. Today I'm going to talk about the theoretical approaches in the study of cross-strait political relations. And basically this is to talk about the theories that we political scientists have developed in the field. So it will be a little bit formalistic, but I would really want to take this opportunity to present those theories because I think we can get interesting insights from them, but not bound by them. And I would like to start with Mind Yu's new course. I think his new course is really historic, because it is not only different from Chen Shui-bian's assertiveness against mainland China, it is also a far cry from the traditional KMT's line of intransigence, so it's unprecedented. And its implications from the current rapprochement will be really profound. So there's a great urgency for us to understand cross-strait relations, but then the absolute majority of studies in the field have not gone beyond journalistic accounts of events, partisan arguments, policy debates, and wishful thinking. So there's a great need in-depth theoretical understanding of cross-strait relations. Now let's take a look at the theoretical literature. You can find that there are 3 categories: cross-strait interaction, domestic politics, and international relations. As far as cross-strait interaction is concerned, we will be discussing divided nation model, integration theory, and power symmetry paradigm. As far as domestic politics is concerned, we have vote maximizing model, the state-society paradigm, and political psychology theory. And finally, when we discuss international relations, I would concentrate on the strategic triangle theory. And I think all of them can provide very useful insights to grasp the vicissitudes of cross-strait relations. So the first dimension is cross-strait interaction. Namely, we first concentrate on the interaction, on the cross-strait relations themselves. And the first model is a divided nation model, which basically talks about politically united nation that was later divided into separate entities. So, as Henderson, Leboff, and Stockinger said, that divided nations typically would evolve through 3 stages. The first stage is characterized by high hostility, non-recognition, and military solution. But then when they move into the second stage, you will find that they would accept coexistence, tacit recognition, reduced ideological confrontation, and non-military solution. And the third stage is active rapprochement, intensive communications, leading up to loose political amalgamation and even symbolic unification. Now, this so-called natural evolution of divided nations obviously is not necessarily borne out by the German and Vietnamese cases, because in the German case, we've seen the collapse of the East German state and the annexation, basically, of those landers into West Germany. And in the case of Vietnam, it was just a sheer military forceful conquest of the South by the North. Qiu Hongda and Wei Yun introduced the divided nation model to the Taiwan mainland diet. And Zhang Wuye asks a very interesting question, namely equality and dual recognition that are characteristic of the inter-German and inter-Korean relations cannot be found in cross-strait relations. So if we compare Taiwan cross-strait relations to Korean situation, to German situations, we find that there's a very conspicuous difference between the two. Namely, there's no equality and dual recognition. Mass new course and cross-strait rapprochement probably will breathe new life into the divided nation approach, because we are seeing more recognition from the Chinese mainland, even though that not to the expectations of people in Taiwan, but the situation seems to be improving and moving towards that direction. So could be the case that divided nation model is actually right in describing the long-term evolution of cross-strait relations? Now, as a very prominent example of divided nation model, the 1992 consensus, vaguely defined, is still the common language between Ma Ying-jeou and Hu Jintao. And so when 1992 consensus is accepted by both sides, the two sides can reach some kind of compromise. And 1992 consensus is basically a divided nation framework. So does that mean that we will move into the second or the third stage? Well, we shall see. The second theory is integration. Its base is that if countries have common cultural roots and desire to achieve maximum economic efficiency and prosperity, then integration is possible. So economy is in command. And it's primarily based on European integration on examples like functionalism, neo-functionalism, and federalism. Now, the emphasis of this theory is on whether there will be spillover or spillback. Spillover means that intensive economic integration would bring about corresponding changes in non-economic spheres, so spill over to those different spheres, like politics and so on and so forth. But then spillback suggests that if there is political differences so huge that it can bring the economic momentum, it can reduce economic momentum, and thus it will spill back from the political realm to the economic realm and arrest the economic momentum for deeper relations between the two sides. So the core question is whether there will be spillover to the the political sphere, or there will be a spillback from the political realm to the economic realm. If we apply integration theory to cross-strait relations, we can find 3 types of reasoning. The first reasoning is that deepening will bring about spillover, and that's desirable. And that's the logic, that's the expectations of Beijing, and those in Taiwan who would love to see some kind of pro-unification outcome of cross-strait relations. Not necessarily united as one country, but at least some form of political amalgamation, even confederation. The second reasoning would say that, well, deepening will bring about spillback, as we have just mentioned. And third reasoning would say that deepening will bring about spillover, but that's undesirable. Li Denghui's southward policy is exactly based on an integration understanding of cross-strait relations. He's afraid of deepening of relations will bring about political changes in Taiwan, which is undesirable. And a lot of opposition to mind you's Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA, the hottest issue today in Taiwan, is based on this understanding. Namely, if we deepen our economic relations with mainland China, then that will bring about the 5th column. They would ultimately annex us. The third theory is power symmetry paradigm. And we all know that Taiwan is not just lagging behind mainland China in terms of aggregate dimensions, but also in average terms. In 1999, Taiwan's per capita GDP was 15.7 times higher than that of the mainland. 10 years later, the difference shrank to 5.4 times, and it will shrink very rapidly after the financial crisis. The power asymmetry impacts on diplomatic competition, military balance, investment decisions, even on identity formation. And based on a study of the relation between Russia and the non-Russian post-Soviet countries, I find that there are several conclusions. The first one is Taiwan can only opt for balancing or bandwagoning. Equal relation is excluded. It's very hard to get an equal relationship with an overwhelming strong neighbor. Secondly, as the economic gap between the two sides is still enormous, then Taipei tends to balance. However, if the gap is closing, then balancing would gradually shift to bandwagoning. The third point is Taipei's balancing strategy is reinforced by the support the U.S. gives to Taiwan. If the American support is dwindling, then balancing is likely to give way to some form of bandwagoning. And the fourth point is that there are various political forces in Taiwan championing different mainland policies. In a way, Taiwan is a little bit like Ukraine, with division between the eastern part and western part, and historical legacy, and so on and so forth. Power symmetry paradigm, Brandy Womack, by studying the relationship between China and Vietnam, says that the asymmetry of power is redressed by an opposite symmetry of will, namely the big power has overwhelming power over the small one, but then the small state would have much more attention and is more willing to take whatever it takes to this relationship because its very survival is at stake. So you got a symmetry of power, but then a symmetry of will, on the other hand, offsetting the advantages that the strong country is enjoying over the small one. So the result is there will be a natural process from mistrust, misperception, to open conflict, to painful learning, and then to a compromise. Because the strong typically fails to subdue the weak, but the weak bears the burden of the costs from open conflict. The two will settle with an exchange of recognition for deference. Recognition for deference. So is it borne out by the newest development and Finlandization, as Yun-Han has just mentioned? Would that be a kind of exchange of recognition for deference? It's very interesting. And finally, we have a historical comparison of the cross-relations today with that of cross-relations between Koxinga's Dongning Kingdom versus the Manchu dynasty. That relationship turned from a war between a Ming general and invading barbarians to one between a consolidated Chinese dynasty and the forces still loyal to the old empire. Kangxi Huangdi showed great willingness at the time actually to pacify the Zheng kingdom as long as the latter paid allegiance to the new rulers in Beijing. But then the Taiwan kingdom was also interested in gaining a vassal state status a la Korea. So there was a tempted but failed compromise. And the tricky issue is hairstyle. Is Beijing today interested in a traditional hierarchical international system in East Asia, one in which traditionally China dominated and can accept a high degree of autonomy or something like a vassal state status for Taiwan? I think it's quite likely that many people in Beijing will think in historical terms, know how many historical soap operas those leaders in Zhongnanhai are consuming today and the very place they are making decisions. I mean, Zhongnanhai, Forbidden City, and looking at the palace and so on and so forth. Now, domestic politics. The first model is vote maximizing, and which means that all the major political parties are vote maximizers. And at least in the 1990s, we found a convergent pattern among the parties towards ideological center. But then, when we move into the 21st century, we've seen competitive radicalization under the DPP's rule. But still, this is a behavior of vote maximizing. You want to maximize your vote, and so you take specific positions on cross-strait relations in order to whip up your support. And the change of electoral system from SMTV to MMN, which is a more majoritarian system, has disciplined the DPP because in the elections of 2008, both presidential and parliamentary, they suffered unprecedented landscape defeat. And from that on, they become more realistic and they have regained some of the support. So there's a drive towards moderation. All this is based on the political electoral structure and the need to maximize vote. The defect of which is that it says nothing about the main themes of political contestation. Just what are the ultimate driving forces in Taiwan that would make vote maximization lead political parties into specific positions. And so we would move into the state-society paradigm. And my able colleague Len Zegang has developed a theme by talking about developmental state in Taiwan. Thomas Johnson, my former teacher at UC Berkeley, was the first one who coined the term developmental state. But the developmental state has been turned upside down. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically authoritarian state capable of directing economic development has been turned upside down, and right now it's the local business interests and big companies that are exercising great influence on the government. No details into this. So what we have seen is interest has become a major factor in defining cross-strait relation. Cross-strait relation is perceived as whether it serves the interest, material interest of the people. But the other line of political contestation, is identity. Numerous surveys have been conducted that explore into the changing preference of the public in Taiwan on future of the nation preference. we all know that the preference for sustaining status quo is always more popular than seeking independence or unification with the mainland. But then there has been a steady rise of support for independence and the corresponding decline of support for unification. And there, the Hak-Lok group has been more supportive of independence, but then the mainlanders on the other extreme, and Hakka is sitting in between. And this is stuff that I think all of you are familiar with. On the national identity, those who identify themselves to be exclusively Chinese drop precipitously in number, and those identifying themselves exclusively Taiwanese rose rapidly. And the dual identifiers was the dominant among the three, but then towards the end of Chen Shui-bian's reign, the dual identifiers dropped even below exclusive Taiwanese in number. Okay. So what we have, we now move to the international relations, and this is a strategic triangle. And because we are going to talk about strategic triangle in this afternoon session, suffice it to say that Ma Ying-jeou's new course is to shift from Taiwan's position from an outcast to a friend, if not pivot. An outcast is against two other players who are partners, because Chen Shui-bian's provocativeness has angered not only United States, not only Beijing, but Washington. So it's an undesirable position. And Ma Ying-jeou would like to shift Taiwan's position to a friend, namely in a ménage à trois, where all three are enjoying good relations. Well, today the relationship between the United States and China is not that good, but compared with some years ago, it still can be considered as an improvement. So what I'm doing is to put all these together and present a sequential model. Namely, during the inter-election period, the strategic triangle dominates, and Taiwan would take a position that would suit its strategic goals. But then, when election comes, then domestic politics will become more important. As you can see, domestic competition is basically about interest and identity. So domestic factors and international factors alternate in determining actions by the players. And if we want to know the direction of those factors are pushing cross-strait relations to, then strategic triangle would tend to improve relations between Taiwan and the PRC because it's a good strategic choice. So I have a plus, red plus there. And the interest dimension in domestic competition would also push Taiwan towards improving relations with the PRC because it's, economically speaking, at least for most of the people, it seems to be beneficial. But then, as far as identity is concerned, it's the other way around because Taiwan has developed very strong, autonomous, even nationalistic Taiwanese identity. So that area we have seen some checks on deepening of cross-strait relations. The divided nation model also is pushing for positive cross-strait relations, integration theories, but power symmetry is not in the same direction because Taiwan has been overwhelmed by mainland China, and so less and less people in Taiwan are willing to identify themselves as Chinese because China as an identity has been monopolized by the other side. So if you say you are a Chinese, then it means that you are identified with them. So even if you may think that you are a Chinese culturally and so on and so forth, you will not call yourself a Chinese because you don't want to be mistaken as a Chinese on mainland China. That has to do with power symmetry. But then power symmetry in strategic triangle is pushing for better relations between Taiwan and the PRC because that's wise for a weak state to develop good relations with a stronger neighbor. So I put all these theories together and come up with this model. But then obviously the political model is inadequate. Even though we can have all these dimensions, mentioned in the political models, one is conspicuously missing, namely the society-to-society relationship. And this is what this conference, I think, is about. It's about spouses, it's about students, it's about religion, it's about mass media, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
We have 3 discussions. Let's see. What is our sequence of discussions? Thank you. Our first discussant will be Professor Wu, actually, so he should stay up here. He will discuss WEN-HSIN's paper. He needs no introduction. A second.
For the sake of time, I will be very brief. I think Professor YU-SHAN's paper is an excellent one. It talks about the relationship between historiography and politics. My comments actually are composed of 3 questions. The first one is there any limit of historiography? By which I mean, as a political scientist, asking this question to a historian. Is it possible that we can collect historical facts, mold them, give them assessments and judgments, and create historiography that can suit the needs of any political party or political force? Is there any limit to the way in which we can mold history? Is history always selectively interpreted and can be phrased and paraphrased in ways that we like it? Or there are still some basic facts that cannot be changed? And so if you are loyal to history, it would lead you to specific understanding and probably specific political positions. I would like to know whether there is any limit on historiography. The second question is the relationship between historiography and politics. Professor Ye talked about the historiography, the revisionist historiography that concentrates on maritime interpretation of Taiwan's history, and it's very important. But it seems to me that she projects this as a kind of reflection of Taiwan's nation-building process. And my own feeling is that this reinterpretation of Taiwan's past, this revisionist historiography that centers on the maritime aspect of Taiwan's history, is actually the driving force behind political change in Taiwan. Namely, I'm wondering whether she would be willing to give a more active role to the historians who are doing revisionism in Taiwan in bringing about political change. Because in politics, it's perceptions that matter. And historiography definitely can change the perceptions of people. So if I read different history books, and I learn that I'm actually an entirely different person than my education has attempted to make me believe, then certainly I would change my attitudes and I would vote for an entirely different political party. So there's a tremendous political vested interest in coming up with a different historiography. So I'm wondering, when we are talking about different historiographies in Taiwan, it boils down actually about the competition between different political forces, and different political forces are trying to nurture different historiographies, and so this is all about politics, forgive me. And the third question, the final question is, Professor Ye mentioned something like when Japan took over Taiwan, and it took a lot of measures that swiftly reduced the relationship between Taiwan and mainland China to a minimum. And after 1949, the interactions between Taiwan and mainland China also dwindled to about zero because of the confrontation between the two. And that obviously had a lot to do with the development of the revisionist historiography in Taiwan, because you don't have any contact with the other side. How can you develop a historiography that says that you are actually a part of them, or that you are from the same ancestors and so on and so forth? You would definitely put more emphasis on geography. My question is, if that's the case, then the expanded cross-strait relations that we are experiencing nowadays, would that avert the trend? Would that make more people think that, actually, I mean, they were educated to be Chinese, but then they learned from political process and from other things going on that they are actually Taiwanese and not Chinese. But then after this cross-strait relations and so on and so forth, people marrying and religions and so on and so forth, they again find that, oh, I'm still Chinese. Could that be possible? Is historiography something that is the creation of the historians, or is it a reflection actually of the underlying society and their concrete interactions and exchanges across the strait? So these are the three questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those very interesting and intriguing questions. Our second discussant will be Professor Gao Hui, who is Professor of International Politics at Kinmen Institute of Technology, which I understand just last year has become a university. Is that correct? And he spent, he was a distinguished visiting scholar at UC Berkeley. He will discuss both Michael SZONYI's paper and YU-SHAN's paper. Who could be found that would be better to discuss the discussion of Kinmen from Kinmen University here?
Distinguished moderator and presenters and the scholars at present. I have two papers to discuss. The first one is Dr. SZONYI's. He has a very beautiful Chinese name, Song Yimin, Song Jiaosou. I think his paper is why I'm here, because he discussed about Kinmen. I'm much honored to be the discussant of Professor SZONYI's great paper, especially since I'm a professor of Kinmen. I'm very gratified a world-renowned scholar devotes such attention to the issue of Kinmen. Professor SZONYI is an expert on the Kinmen issue, and he has published a monograph, Cold War Island, Women on the Front Line, and many publications. I find myself very much in agreement with the thesis of this paper, which is the local issues of Kinmen and the issues of cross-strait relations are more and more closely linked together. And this trend may be extended to become an example of the growing linkages between local issues of Taiwan and the cross-strait relations issues. I would like to argument this thesis with some future directions and structures of argument of your reference. When I began to teach in Kinmen about 4 years ago, I realized when studying cross-strait relations, the trilateral relations of US, PRC, Taiwan, is a structural factor that cannot be neglected. US and the Chinese mainland are very distant, and their relations may be called the cross-Pacific relations. This big cross-Pacific relations has an inseparable pull on cross-strait relations. Though Kinmen and YU-SHAN are two gates. Kinmen YU-SHAN 是两个门啊 two gates, facing each other, are near to each other. They are still cross-strait relations. This small cross-strait relation between Kinmen and YU-SHAN is a part of the cross-Taiwan Strait relations, and it's an important structural component of the whole. Therefore, the Kinmen-YU-SHAN relationship, the cross-Taiwan Strait relations, and the cross-Pacific relationship are all interlocking cross-strait relations. And it could be said the Kinmen-YU-SHAN relationship may serve as a level. We might illustrate this with the August 23rd bombardment, 823炮战, to the meaning thrillings of the recent years, 从823炮战到小三通的开通. That is to say, from the perspective of Kinmen-YU-SHAN local people, they may take the Kinmen-YU-SHAN relationship to be regional development issues directly influencing them, while fortunately or not, the Kinmen-YU-SHAN relationship is precisely cross-strait relationship, and an important structural component at that. The theme of this paper is how regional development and cross-strait relations interact when they are so interconnected. This paper's 4 case studies include the casino debate, the Jinsha Bridge debate, demilitarization, and trade. I briefly add 2 aspects to your paper, which Dr. SZONYI in his oral report already talked about it, which are the electricity and the water supply of Kinmen. The ample supply of electricity and water is a basic requirement for the development of any locality. Yet, the electricity and water supply of Kinmen do not meet the development needs of Kinmen and needs to be greatly increased. Take the example of water. Groundwater is the indispensable ingredient of Kinmen Gaoliang wine, which I like very much. Kinmen's most important source of income. Yet it overly extracted, there are concerns that seawater might seep into underground aquifer. Therefore, buying and channeling water from the mainland naturally becomes a solution for the local people of Kinmen. In addition, the electricity supply of Kinmen is basically thermal power plants, and the cost is very high, becoming a great burden for the power company. If Kinmen could buy electricity from YU-SHAN, it would naturally be cheaper and economical. As to the supply of electricity and water, the mainland is very eager in the last few years and made several concrete proposals. And the local political figures of Kinmen publicly advocated buying electricity and water from the mainland. But the central government in Taipei, of course, has many reservations. With regards to water, it suggests using desalination of the seawater, and with regard to electricity, keeps using high-price electricity generation. The reasons are clear. electricity and water are both strategic resources now. And the Kinmen strategic resources, of course, could not be controlled by the mainland. Whether Kinmen should buy electricity and water from the mainland, like the issue of whether Taiwan should develop closer economic interdependence relations with the mainland, has the basic qualities of economic aspects, but also has political and strategic aspects of influences and considerations. With regards to local issues and cross-strait relations, there are broadly two schools of opinion. One side is passionate and eager, hoping to pull Kinmen and Xiamen together and focus on building Kinmen-Xiamen Bridge and the Kinmen-Xiamen Special Zone. The other side is relatively calm, hoping to evaluate cautiously and evaluate more aspects, such as national security, economic benefits, and sovereignty disputes. An important research approach is how to mediate between these two different aspects of thinking, so to reach satisfying outcome for these issues. Basically, the former school, the opinion hoping for Kinmen-Xiamen integration starts more from the perspective of regional development, such as how could Kinmen and Xiamen, through more convenient access and more precision in division of labor, to complement each other and develop together. While on the other side, the more cautious, hoping to go step by step, school of opinion starts more from the perspective of cross-strait relations. When we observe the policy of the Ma-Ying-jeou administration, such as supporting building the bridge between large Kinmen and small Kinmen, but deferring the Jin-Sha bridge, we could see it obviously attaches great importance to Kinmen's regional development. But this could not come at the expenses of cross-strait relations. How to find an equilibrium point between regional development and cross-strait relations may provide very good inspiration for the development of relations across the Taiwan Strait. For example, recent news reports say the China Telecom of the mainland and the Taiwan's Zhonghua Telecom cooperates in developing the direct optic cable from Kinmen to Xiamen, investing more than 100 million NT dollars after the seabed optic cable is built. The transmission capability of the cross-strait communication lines will be increased tenfold, and the phone charges will decrease greatly. When that time comes, the calls from Taiwan to mainland will go through the telecommunication optic cables to Xiamen's telecommunication networks, and go through Xiamen's telecommunication platform to other provinces and municipalities of the mainland. While calls from other provinces and municipalities of the mainland of Taiwan will be merged in Xiamen and transferred through the optic cables from Kinmen to Xiamen. This is indeed a case where it's beneficial for both regional development and cross-strait relations. This is my discussion to the SZONYI's paper. And I will continue to present the 朱英汉教授 Professor's Juice. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to provide some opinion for Professor Zhu's paper. Yet this discussion, hard and soft issue, is somewhat sensitive for middle-aged males, such like me. Because middle-aged men usually enter the so-called what should be hard is not hard, and what should be soft is not soft stage. For example, our arteries ought to be soft, yet they increasingly harden. As to what should be hard, but increasingly soften, I couldn't come up with an example right now. Please think one. Before the concept of soft power was widely discussed in the academic community, the Chinese already have some interesting proverbs on softness and hardness. For example, 吃软不吃硬. 吃软不吃硬. Open to discussion, but not conversion. Literally, eating softness, but not hardness. If someone is recognized or self-recognized as 吃软不吃硬, this usually means he is more civilized and reasonable, and more generous and magnanimous, and has real strength, not afraid of being challenged to play hardball. On the contrary, most people would not to be characterized as 吃硬不吃软, because this represents savage and brutality, but actually weak and powerless. In the context of the rise of mainland China, China would like to be seen as a 吃软不吃硬 character. From this perspective, Professor Zhu's argument is at agreement with Chinese philosophical wisdom. Rumor has it that the CCP leader Hu Jintao's policy toward Taiwan has a way of talking about soft and hard. The soft part even softer, the hard part even harder. 软的更软，硬的更硬. This is the traditional two-hand policy of the CCP, hard on one hand and soft on the other. With regard to its policy toward Taiwan, hard means going to the length of using non-peaceful means to resolve the Taiwan problem, while soft means using peaceful and conciliatory means to resolve the Taiwan problem. In 2008, the plebiscite in Taiwan for entering the UN didn't pass, and the KMT, which advocates the 1992 consensus, won control of the government, opening a new state of affairs in the Taiwan Strait and welcomed by the CCP authorities. Therefore, we saw more of the softer part even softer in this stage. And the most important indicators is the CCP aided phase of peaceful development before the ultimate goal of peaceful reunification. And this is the background of Professor Zhu's paper, arguing now is an opportune moment for Taiwan to bring its soft power into full play. There's another widely used soft and hard phrase, which is the software and the hardware in computer technology. And this concept has been widely used in different spheres. With regard to cross-strait comparisons, most people on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait would agree. The hardware construction on the mainland is advancing quickly, while Taiwan still has an edge in software power. And this is an important basis for Taiwan to bring its soft power into full play in cross-strait relations. Professor Zhu's paper argues when Taiwan deploys its soft power in cross-strait relations, it would be beneficial for Chinese mainland's democratic development and peaceful evolution. I'm in full agreement, and I think if it works, it will also be a positive development for the US-PRC great powers relationships. Since the hard power between US and the PRC is also symmetrical, and the PRC is very assertive in increasing her hard power to deal with the US. If US and the PRC goes on the road of playing hardball, it would not be good news for the world. On the other hand, if mainland China could be influenced by Taiwan and develop soft power to deal with Sino-American relations, this ought to be welcomed by all. Professor Zhu used the tail wagging the dog as his subtitle, which is interesting but also risky. What's interesting is the tail could only be alive on a dog, while the dog could live without a tail, although this would not be a pretty sight. Furthermore, a dog that wags its tail would be lovely, while a barking dog is annoying. The risk would be the Chinese may like dogs, but certainly would not like to be considered analogous to dogs. Thank you, everyone.
Very interesting interpretation of metaphors. Our final discussant is, also needs no introduction. She can turn the tables on YU-SHAN, YU-SHAN.
First of all, my thanks to Professor YU-SHAN for his pressing sets of questions, and it's my pleasure to return the favor. Now, Professor Wu has given us a measured, comprehensive overview of the political theory literature concerning cross-strait events. He has also presented us with a rich set of information, altogether offering us a comprehensive as well as a thoughtful overview of the circumstances of the factors to be taken into account when Taiwan seeks to think of its situation as a nation state vis-a-vis China or in the international context, and how political theory may or may not be applied in various contexts with regard to the thinking. Now, as a historian, of course, my response would come along the lines of the following. So the first question concerns the classic issue about the fit between political theories and historical circumstances. Given that historical circumstances which are not in themselves immediately or self-evidently intelligible without narrative intervention or historical construction. Historical circumstances or contemporary circumstances as the result of historical constructions, in a way, provide shifting or moving ground or target when it comes to the application of political theories, or when it comes to the choice of political theories that is to be applied to an understanding of the situation. So my first question to Professor Wu is about the fit, or about the choice of the fit, or about how would you know that you are making the right choice and this is the choice of fit. The next issue here, the next question here is things change over time. That is, even for political scientists committed to issues of contemporary development, things differ between yesterday and today, this morning, this afternoon, tomorrow, last month, next month, a year ago, a decade ago, vis-a-vis next year, 5 years from now. So given the fact that things evolve or unfold in continuum, what then? Where does a political theorist place himself in this continuum of time that in some ways upsets or sabotages the very sense of stability that a quote-unquote contemporary narrative sometimes offers, or that sense of coherence or stability in the description of a contemporary situation. So my second question in some ways is that how do we accommodate the factor of change in thinking our way through this spectrum of historical or political theories and their applicability? The third question, in some ways, is a classic question once again. Namely, there are political theories which are meant to describe better than to prescribe. And there are also things that sometimes we denounce as political philosophy, which nonetheless have a more compelling capacity to prescribe, to offer suggestions of the historical logic which seem inevitable in pointing our way towards a future and suggesting trends of the towards the future. Or to quote somebody whose name should not be mentioned in this context, sometimes you raise questions about the purpose of knowledge, namely whether it is to understand situations or to make changes in situations in history. So I suppose my third question to Professor Wu in this context is that as we think about, yes, yes, Sarah. Anyway, so as we think about the choices here, we also ask ourselves, what would be the purpose or the function of application of political theories? Or where do political theories derive their compelling force from? So those are my three questions concerning theory. And then inspired by the papers of Professor Zhu as well as Professor SZONYI, let me add two more questions concerning the issue of political or power in politics. So the first question here is the question of strategic effectiveness. Namely, when it comes to political actors to exercise this capacity to leverage, is it necessarily the kind of situation that had to be completely lined up, that the strategic significance of an actor or an action has to be equated with this actor's centrality in a narrative scenario? Now, in a way, that's a question that's directed to myself as well. And then the second question in that context is that for people to exercise political leverage, whether they speak from within the context of a narrative in which they place themselves at a position of centrality, is it or is it not necessary that they also speak from a position of complete clarity with regard to the self-understanding of identity and interest? My hunch, drawing on those two other papers, is that sometimes this kind of perfect alignment is neither possible nor necessary, and it actually opens up theoretical possibilities if we do a little bit more work there, differentiating among the necessity or the desirability of these kinds of perfect alignment. And the second point here is that Well, I mean, it's perfectly desirable to be able to act decisively, to know exactly what you are doing, and to know that you are in a position of effectiveness. On the other hand, is marginality or ambiguity necessarily a disadvantage? Or in what way the game of power in politics, and to make it fun, more fun than usual, is exactly to turn the table on the bigger powers or to challenge what historically or theoretically might seem to be inescapable or predictable. Thank you.
You've been extremely patient audience, and I know you are brimming full of questions. So before I give our presenters a chance to respond to these very stimulating questions, I'd like to open the floor. We have permission from the chair here to extend our session to 12:30. So let me open the floor for the next 20 minutes. Please use your microphone. When you speak into the microphone, identify yourselves. You don't need to stand up, since you can just push the button and turn the microphone on from your seat. Identify yourselves and try to make a brief question, as brief as possible, and try to hold the speeches to a minimum. Okay. Yes?
Pang Jianguo from Chinese Culture University. I have a question for Professor Zhu Yunhan, and Professor Wu-Shan may also answer it. Basically, I agree with you that Taiwan can exert soft power on mainland China to a certain degree, including serving as an example of democratization. However, there is another argument, I think, by your teacher, Andrew Nathan, talking about resilient authoritarianism. That means the CCP regime may stay in an authoritarian style for quite a long time, rather than transforming into a democratic regime gradually, with or without various impacts. So I would like to know your comments about that.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
George Chai from Chinese Culture University. I have the same question to Zhu Yunhan, my good friend. Okay, in your PowerPoint, you say that you mentioned that the shift of policy from Beijing side. I think probably if we speak that too fast, most likely I think China has changed, somewhat shifted the policy priority instead of changing the policy fundamentally toward Taiwan. That's the first one. And the second one, I think you talk about the soft power. Okay, I can really agree with you about the economy, about Taiwan's democracy or freedom, the process of our modernization and the creativity. But my question is, how can we put those factors more effectively to influence China's side? We all understand the factors you mentioned, but how to use those in a more effective way? And that's a question I would like to ask. And I have another question for Wu-Shan. In your paper, you discussed about the finlandization. I think it was you, right? Instead of Zhu Yunhan. Yeah, both of you have mentioned about finlandization. I just wonder if, say, 15 years from now, what kind of leverage we still have in Taiwan? Okay, in our competition with China side, if there are only two options available, one is finlandization, another one is Hong Kongization. Okay, which one do you think is more likely to happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Stefan Fleischauer from the Institute of Political Science here, visiting scholar. Just one question both to Professor Wu and Professor Zhu. In analyzing cross-strait relations, we have so far assumed that China will remain a rather stable factor in those interplay. But there are scholars who have challenged this position, claiming that the very survival of China as a unified state might be in jeopardy in the future, due to possible economic decline, for example. So do you think that might be another possibility for future cross-strait interactions, and what kind of impact would that have on Taiwan?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Sarah Friedman from Indiana University. I have a question both for Michael SZONYI and for Professor Wu, and this is building from Professor Ye's comment about identities perhaps not being as consolidated and stable as we might think, and I'm struck by the return of a slightly more rigid state-society model in both of your papers, and how you might think about breaking down that model in light of the various different kinds of connections that these papers have shown between different levels of state actors, Michael, in your case, Beijing as opposed to Xiamen, for instance. And that nice diagram, Professor Wu, that you showed at the end, I'm struck by the unified nature there of something called Chinese society and something called Taiwanese society. And in fact, also in Professor Chu Yunhan's paper, you showed very nicely that there are very different kinds of actors involved in these interactions, and that rigid state-society model might do us more disservice than help us in understanding these complex relationships.
Thank you. Yes.
My comment goes to Professor ZHONYI. I think I appreciate the effort because someone really has finally given a look at Kinmen, which has been a fascinating place to be looked at, especially in terms of cross relations. But I think we can hardly look at Kinmen without noticing several interesting features of the place. First, it's probably the only land on Earth that has enjoyed uninterrupted jurisdiction by the ROC. That's probably the only land. And we think that the ROC state has been transforming itself, so Kinmen will be a very nice laboratory to be looked at. I think it's a fascinating place to look at. And second is that if you run a regression on people's voting behavior, you'll find it very interesting because given the average socioeconomic status and educational level and sub-ethnicity of the Kinmen people, you would think that they vote for the DPP. But in fact, they vote for the KMT all the way. So I think in terms of both the historical location and the relation between Kinmen and Taiwan, it's a fascinating place to be looked at. And another point to make it is that most people think Kinmen is just a gate to China. And it happens that Xiamen is another gate. So that Kinmen is both in the frontier and in the periphery. So it's a very interesting place to look at. And I thank your effort for trying to do that.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Nathan Bato, Institute of Political Science here at Academia Sinica. Professor SZONYI, I also was fascinated by the paper on Kinmen because we as experts on Taiwan often just kind of gloss over Kinmen. And I was struck by something you said about cross-straits limiting the structure of alternatives. And there's a fascinating parallel between Kinmen and the old American South, which half a century ago, V.O. Key wrote a very influential book about. And his central point was that because the overriding issue, in that case segregation, limited the opinions, the South had to essentially govern itself without political parties. And Kinmen basically also has to govern itself without the use of political parties. Everybody's on the same side. And so I'm wondering about the structure of these political debates. How are these debates formed between the people who want more integration with China and less or faster or slower? How are they structured? Are they just centered around individual personalities and clientelism, or is there some actual structure to these debates?
Thank you. Any other questions? Let's see. I guess let me ask a question to Professor Zhu as well. My question, I've been skeptical of soft power because of the limited fungibility of soft and hard power. I mean, if soft power counts in a soft contest, but hard power counts in a hard contest, I think. I mean, we fought, World War II, we fought Nazi Germany, and they had very little soft power, but they had hard power, and so they were very difficult to defeat. Soft power played very little role in that contest. Even if you could say that there are three types of power. There's economic power, there's soft power, and then there's military power, right? Even economic power, does soft power determine economic power? Was there any fungibility between economic power and soft power? We see Japan, China having their biggest trade relations of all time, and yet there's very great suspicion between them during the Chen Shui-bian period. We had very strong trade between, so that's the question. And I will leave since we have no more questions, I could see that I'll give each presenter then 3 minutes, since we have very little time before. 3 minutes. Let's see. First, in the same order, let's say. That's first YU-SHAN.
We go up there?
Yes. Suit yourself. You want to sit here?
Okay, since you're,
Okay.
I think it's faster this way, right? Okay. Well, my thanks to Professor Wu for his three very interesting questions. So the first one, are there any limits to historiographical construction of history? Should there be constraints imposed by facts? The answer, of course, is yes. One could say that there are two spectrums, or one could take up position on either end of the spectrum. Historical fiction, which is fictionalized, or empirical data, which is data with very few or very little narrative, interpretive intervention. So solid or compelling historical interpretation is by and large always something somewhere in between. The second question is the issue about connections between history and politics. Now, of course, as we know, in any of these nationalistic discourse, historical thinking is precisely where nation states or the imagined community about a nation begins. So I don't think that we are ever going to shortchange historians in that regard. That I'm certainly happy to say that this is the one occasion when historical research appears to be relevant to a contemporary event. And then the third question concerning interactions between China and Taiwan today, that is implicitly the question is, will the expansion or increase of interactions between the two sides eventually help to foster or sustain the rise of a Chinese identity as opposed to the isolationism or the insularity of a situation in which, say, Taiwan remains simply Taiwan. Now, I think that for those who study the history of modern Chinese nationalism, it's a fairly familiar phenomenon that nationalistic awareness typically develops within the context of heightened internationalized interactions. In other words, it's precisely through the interactions or encounters between different groups of people that people come to define their differences and make choices on their identity. So my quick response to Professor Wu's question here is perhaps it's a maybe. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the questions and also for the commentary by Professor Gao. I'm actually going to devote my time to the questions because I think we seem to be very much in agreement. Although I will thank you for this notion of different approaches being either a cross-straits primary or a regional development primary approach. That's going to be very useful as I think these things through. Thank you also for the comments about Kinmen's distinctiveness. I'm a historian among political scientists, so you started to scare me a little bit when you mentioned regression. But in fact, I have looked at voting records. You don't actually need to do regressions on Kinmen. It's the most pan-blue constituency, I'm sure, in all of Taiwan. You might need to do some regressions on the divisions within the blues, but it's on the issue of being simultaneously frontier and periphery. Of course, this is one of the things that makes Kinmen so interesting. To relate that to my talk, I think one could say that to the extent that we privilege caution and the three mini-links, Kinmen-Xiamen is a frontier. To the extent that cross-straits relations intensifies more rapidly and the three big links becomes more dominant, Kinmen returns to a periphery. And this, of course, is the great concern among the people of Kinmen, that a lot of these regional development plans rest on it being very difficult to get directly to Shanghai or directly to Beijing. The second set of questions, well, can you come and see me and give me that reference? It sounds fascinating. In many ways, both of your questions were about the structure of political debates. And actually, I really found myself, in answer to your question, Sarah, somewhat trapped by language. Because clearly there are multiple levels of state on both sides. There are multiple constituencies within each level, and there are complex interrelations between elements within society and elements within the state. And one of the other challenges, of course, is that I can actually go to the magistrate and ask him what he thinks about cross-straits relations, whereas Hu Jintao does not take my calls. And so it seems that I have a sort of much richer sense of local politics simply because of the data. On the issue of the structure of political debates, I'll take one more minute, if I may. There was an interesting phase where Kinmen local activists found common cause with the DPP, perhaps 10, 15 years ago. And then whoever it was, Shimington, I think, said, well, we'll tell you what, we'll give Kinmen back in exchange for a cross-straits peace treaty. And that was sort of the end of common cause. And it meant that, indeed, the political parties are virtually irrelevant in the cross-straits debates as they apply locally to Kinmen. I don't know. It's an excellent question, what that implies about how these debates are structured. I'm going to have to think more about it. But thank you for a very provocative question.
Well, I should thank my discussant and also my colleague who have thrown quite a few questions at me. I don't think I have enough time to answer them all, but let me just try to answer a few of them. Professor Tsai, he argued that, well, there has been some adjustment in Beijing's approach to Taiwan, but this doesn't represent a fundamental shift of their approach. I agree with him, actually, and as I said, that the soft power, takes time to have its effect. If we can trigger fundamental shift, in 10 years, I don't think that would be possible. It's going to be a long haul, the effort. Nevertheless, I would still argue that the fact that Hu Jintao basically mouthful the mantra that the Beijing leader used to utter whenever they have the chance and to use the peace and development, as the guiding principle to conduct cross-strait relation at least for the short and medium term. I think that, for me, that's a marked shift, okay, and significant enough. Professor Pang Jianguo asked me, whether I can reconcile my analysis with Andrew Nathan's argument about resisting authoritarian regime. I would say yes. I think CCP elite actually follow how KMT, the way how KMT cope with the rise of a more assertive, autonomous civil society, and how to introduce partial liberalization without having to open up the political system overnight. How to introduce some small dosage of democratic change, by installment, incremental change, while try to reserve their political predominance in the political arena. I think this is, from my point of view, is also make Taiwan's experiment even more relevant to the incumbent elite in Beijing. My last point, whether how can we exercise our soft power more effectively. I think number one, I think that obviously we should improve the quality of our democracy. We should make it more attractive and convincing. I don't think it's fully convincing at this point. Okay, we have some problem with effective governance. We have problem with partisan gridlock, things like that. Secondly, I think obviously the government can be more supportive of all the bilateral exchange and of the engagement. We should welcome more men and trans students, to come over for study, things like that. And lastly, I would argue that I think the Taiwanese national sentiment won't help a lot, to enhance Taiwan's soft power. I argue that if the tail want to wag the dog, it will have to be culturally and politically still somewhat attached to the dog. Yeah, thank you.
I know my following remarks will be the only thing that is between you and the lunch. So I'll be extremely short. Thank Professor YU-SHAN very much for her questions. I gave her 3 and she gave me 5. Most of her questions are really profound and touches on the difference between history and political science. So I don't think I'm fully prepared to answer the full range of questions that she raised. Suffice to say that the way in which I deal with those theories is not to treat them as binding straitjackets, but rather as assumptions that can be tested. And so if they cannot pass the test, then they will fail and falter, and I will have no sympathy with any of them. And so I don't think that they would be that restricting. About the very function of theories, are they analytical or prescriptive? I think I'm presenting analytical theories, but obviously policymakers would use analytical theories to come up with their policies. And in that sense, it suggests something. And that's based on the value judgments of the politicians. But we are primarily concerned with the analytical aspect of the theories. And sometimes it's better not to know the real situation and to muddle through or whatever. Sometimes if you think that you know the situation, you act on that, and your theory happens to be the false one, and you are going to create huge mistakes. I totally agree with you. But I think that it's only human for us to try to come up with something predictable, and then we can act on that. Otherwise, we will not be able to. For example, get out the door and get a lunchbox if I don't know that such arrangement has been made. So some prediction is necessary for us to lead our lives. And finally, very small response to questions by George, and he said that, are we heading towards Hong Kongization or Finlandization? Neither is desirable, and I think that it's possible for us to slip into either of these positions unless we have active leadership. I do think leadership matters. And the question from Sarah about the one state, one society is very rigid. I totally agree with you, because the reason for me to show diagram is to demonstrate the insufficiencies, the deficiencies of the theories. So I can have different parts of the society and of the state presented, and then we have an increasing number of relations. It would make it even more complicated. But the fact remains the same, namely, we have not done enough for the society relationship. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for a very rich and stimulating session, and bon appetit. And we'll see you back here at what?
1:30.
1:30. Thank you.